space technologies and space activities have developed rather quickly in China over the past few decades, space legislation has been largely lagging behind. Efforts in space legislation can be traced back to the early 1990s. But the comprehensive development of the national space legislation started only after 1998, when the China National Space Administration was designated to be the major body responsible for formulating regulations and policies of the space industry and space technologies, as well as for setting up development plans and standards for space industry. Now, if we look at the current situation in the Chinese national space legislation, there are some features. It's very clear, first of all, China has no national space laws that are made by the National People's Congress or its standing committee, or even by the State Council. As we know, in China, the highest level of laws are to be made by National People's Congress or its standing committee, which can be called national law. Then we will look at any administrative regulations that can be made by the State Council. But unfortunately, we do not have these kind of legal documents. So that's the first very distinct feature. Second, the binding force of legal norms is at a relatively low level. At the moment, the existing legal documents are at the ministerial level, which can be called as administrative rules, which are the lowest level of national legislative hierarchy. This mainly includes, for example, the administrative measures for the registration of space objects, and also the administrative rules for the permits for civil space launch. So that's the second part. And the third feature, we can find out that the existing rules are made by different ministries, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, State Administration for Science, Technology, and Industry for National Defense. So there's a need to unify all these existing rules. Simply because these rules are made by different bodies, there might be some conflicts. So when we look at this aspect, we can find out that the Chinese national laws is quite different from the situation of other spacefaring nations, which generally have a national space law. But if we simply look at the situation about the national space legislation, what I have just mentioned mainly rely on the narrow understanding of a space law. A broad understanding of space law can include the rules governing specific space activities. For example, we talk about the rules for telecommunication services, export controls of space-related products and technologies. Now, when we look at the broad aspect, we do have some laws and regulations at a high level to deal with certain aspects of space activities. For example, we have administrative regulations on telecommunication services. We also have the administrative regulations regarding export controls, etc. So when we look at this aspect, it is quite similar to the situation in other countries. But when we look at the narrow sense, although the Chinese government has already started to talk about the national space legislation for a certain period of time, but unfortunately, there are still some disagreements. So we will need to look into further development. The discussions and the negotiations is still ongoing. So I think we should be optimistic to see some kind of laws at high level to be enacted in the near future in China. Dual-use nature of satellites and the space activities indeed has caused difficulties in the actual regulation. Most existing rules are targeting the civilian aspect or civil use of the space objects or space activities, such as what I have just mentioned regarding the registration of space objects and license for the space launch. However, there are indeed some administrative regulations and rules dealing with the dual use nature or the military related use. For example, administrative regulations on the export controls of military products, export controls of missiles and missile-related items and technologies. However, it is to be noted that China attaches great importance to the peaceful uses of outer space and opposes space militarization. It is stated the objective of peaceful uses of outer space in various legal documents and policies, such as the White Paper on China's space activities. This white paper stresses China's desire to maintain a peaceful and clean outer space so that space activities can benefit all mankind. The current legal framework, while mentioning the peaceful uses of outer space, has focused more on the civil and commercial uses of outer space and space activities. As stated in a white paper, China has 5 major policy objectives in the space field: to strengthen its space presence, to promote the development of space technology and systems, to develop and expand the space application industry, to modernize space governance, and promote international cooperation. So in this regard, I believe that the principle of peaceful uses of outer space and the principle of international cooperation has been the cornerstone to regulate the space activities, and also very important and vital to the balance of military and civilian space objectives within the Chinese legal framework. In general, if I observe the situation in China, China has demonstrated a consistent and positive attitude towards compliance with international space treaties, which is in line with China's policy objectives of building a strong space presence and promoting international cooperation. To be specific, we can look at the Chinese legal obligations under the international legal framework. China ratified the Outer Space Treaty in 1983, and the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention in 1988. When it comes to the Moon Agreement, China is not yet a member, but we also notice that most spacefaring nations are not yet the member to the Moon Agreement. China's pursuit of building a strong space presence include safeguarding the interests of all mankind. That means Chinese space activities not only try to pursue the Chinese interests, it also looking to the interests of all mankind, the interests of all other countries. The goal of promoting international cooperation also requires China to uphold the central role of the United Nations in space affairs. Under the framework of the UN, China actively participated in discussions on international issues and challenges, such as the issue of long-term sustainability, space traffic management, and environmental protection. China has actively contributed to the negotiations on all these legal issues. China emphasizes the importance of multilateral cooperation in the space field, and is willing to cooperate with all the members in the international community. Examples include the APSCO, the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, and open for cooperation in a Tiangong National Space Station. When it comes to the bilateral cooperation, this is also another very important aspect that China has emphasized. There are a lot of bilateral agreement for the space cooperation. One of the most important example is the cooperation between China and Brazil in the launch of remote sensing satellites. The first cooperative protocol was signed in 1988, then was updated in 2002. And last year, the third protocol was signed to further the objectives of the cooperation between the two countries. So consequently, China attaches great importance to the existing space treaties and upholds the principle of international cooperation in the space field. The basic role for China is to carry out multilateral cooperation with the UN as a core forum for the discussion and negotiation. In this regard, I will need to refer to the white paper, which has made it very clear that commercial space activities should be promoted in China. We know in China, a lot of discussion has been carried out which entities should be involved in the space activities. For a long time, we know Chinese government mainly relies on the public entities. That means the military or the public organs. Now they realize space commercialization, space privatization is an ongoing trend, is a future. So China now focuses on the development and expansion of the space application industry, encompassing both public and commercial applications of satellites. Commercial sectors include, for example, telecommunication services and remote sensing for high accuracy maps, data processing and sharing, space launching services, etc. In the meantime, China also plans to apply space technology to new sectors of the space economy, such as space travel, biomedicine, debris removal services. Although these areas are still a new area, China needs to push forward, but a lot of work needs to be done. So China aims to leverage its space capabilities to drive economic growth, enhance social well-being, and foster sustainable development. Ownership and utilization of space resources is a hot topic. We can note in the last few years, a lot of developments were made, in particular after the United States adopted its own act regarding the commercialization of space resources. But if we look at the Chinese approach, it is a bit different from the approach taken by the United States. China favors multilateralism. China believes that the United Nations remains to be the major platform to negotiate for an appropriate legal regime for the issue of commercial use of space resources. The Chinese delegation submitted a proposal in 2021, advocating the establishment of a working group focusing on international rules for space resource activities. This, of course, we know the United States already adopted its own national laws regarding the commercialization of space resources in 2015. And this has aroused a lot of discussions at the international level. Now, China, again, put forward its position, saying that the UN forum should be the ideal place to negotiate, to talk about this issue. China maintains that the current regime of the Outer Space Treaty serves as an indispensable framework for outer space activities, and emphasize that the working group should be guided by international law, in particular, the Outer Space Treaty. This means the Outer Space Treaty, the relevant provisions should continue to apply. We should highly respect all these rules that have been agreed upon in the 1960s and 1970s. If we look at the Outer Space Treaty, Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty regarding the principle of free access to all areas of celestial bodies, free exploration and use by all states without discrimination of any kind, for the benefit and in the interests of all countries shall continue to apply. More importantly, the non-appropriation principle in Article 2 shall also apply and should be highly respected. This, of course, touches upon the sovereignty issue. However, we do find out that the need to balance the interests of the investing entity and the interests of all mankind. That means, on the one hand, if you invest money, invest resources to the space activities, this entity should be able to make money, should be able to profit. Otherwise, no entities would like to get involved in the exploration and utilization of space resources. So that should be some kind of mechanism to encourage the space exploration and utilization. But on the other hand, we noted the Outer Space Treaty made it very clear. The outer space is for all humankind. All the countries, all the human beings are able to benefit from such use of the outer space and space resources. So there's a need to balance these two different types of interests. There are quite some discussions already. Which model should we take? There are discussions, for example, probably the Deep Seabed Authority could be a model. There are also disagreements. So all the discussions should be put forward to the UN working group for study. And the Chinese government taken active attitudes towards such kind of negotiation. And hopefully, in the near future, there will be something coming out. Some rules might be established, adopted to deal with the ownership and utilization of the space resources. The ownership, as I have just mentioned, Article 2 already mentioned about the non-appropriation. No country can claim for sovereignty. So how about the space resources? That will be another barrier or very important issue to resolve. Probably we can avoid the ownership issue. We try to look into the utilization, the right to use. You can use the space resources for profits. So these kind of discussion has been in place. The Chinese government and the Chinese delegation have paid attention to all these discussions. But whatever might be the result, Chinese legal stance would be that all the states shall negotiate within the UN forum to come up with a regime for the utilization of space resources. We are looking to those that have been put down in the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement, not only about the exploration, freedom, liberty to use, but we also look at the terms that have been used in the Moon Agreement regarding the space resources, common heritage of mankind. How do we make a legal regime or come up with a mechanism to satisfy these requirements? That's the most important part. But as I had just mentioned, the multilateralism is believed to be the best ways to come up with such kind of regime. I think it's a very good occasion for me to talk about the space law issue, in particular when it comes to the Chinese national space law and Chinese legal regime regarding space exploration and space activities. I believe that it's very important for any kind of scholars or students to look into the current international legal regime, in particular, the 5 space treaties that were adopted in the 1960s and 1970s, because we believe these 5 space treaties play the fundamental role in the regulation of space activities. And we need to look further to explore new issues that arise. But whatever, what kind of documents or legal regime might come up, we need to rely on these existing legal rules, legal regime. So that's a starting point. Afterwards, of course, if we still looking to the 1960s, 1970s rules, it's not enough. We are now talking about the space commercialization, space privatization. So new issues are coming up. So we will continue the research, and the students, the scholars will need to explore any kind of regime or legal rules may be adopted or used to fill in the gap in the era of space commercialization and privatization.